I was sitting at the kitchen table in my apartment in Columbus, working through a stack of paperwork from the VA office. It was a Tuesday evening, unremarkable in every way, the kind of evening where nothing feels like it matters and everything feels slightly too quiet. My phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. I'm glad I didn't. Rosemary. The soft voice on the other end said slowly, "It's Pastor Caldwell." I hadn't heard that name in years. He had been the pastor at the church my family attended when I was growing up in Mason County, Ohio, a small town tucked between cornfields and county roads where everyone knew your name and at least 3 versions of your business. "How have you been, Pastor?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. There was a pause, the kind of pause that tells you, before the words do, that something hard is coming. "I'm afraid I'm calling with sad news. Rosemary, your grandmother passed away last night." The words landed like a stone dropped in still water. I didn't cry right away. I just sat there, holding the phone, staring at the wall. Grandma Ruth was the one person in my family who never looked at me with disappointment written all over her face. She never told me I was too stubborn, too difficult, or too much. She used to hold my face in her hands and say, "You don't have to stay where you're not wanted, sweetheart." As a kid, I didn't fully understand that. As an adult, I understood it better than I wished I did. Before I go any further, if you are new here, please hit that subscribe button and drop a like on this video. It genuinely helps more than you know. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from right now, your city, your state, your country, whatever you're comfortable sharing. I love knowing who is on the other side of this screen. Now let me tell you the rest of the story. There's something else Pastor Caldwell added quietly. He told me that my grandmother had left behind a will, and according to that will, her farmhouse and the 2 acres of land surrounding it had been left entirely to me. I stared at the wall for a long time after that call ended. The farmhouse, the small white house on the edge of town with the apple tree in the front yard and the porch where Grandma Ruth used to drink her morning tea every single day without fail, no matter how cold it got. The one place in all of Mason County where I had ever felt completely safe. I hadn't been back to that town in almost 8 years. Now, I had a reason to go back, and I already knew deep in my gut that it wouldn't be simple. Because here's the thing about family and money. When those 2 things end up in the same sentence, the truth about people comes out faster than almost anything else in the world. I packed a bag. I got in my old pickup truck, and 2 days later, I was heading back to the place I had promised myself I would never return to. The drive into Mason County felt like being pulled backward through time. The same road signs, the same flat stretches of field, the same water tower with the town's name painted on the side, slightly faded from years of Ohio weather. I cracked the window even though it was cold. The air smelled like fallen leaves and would smoke, exactly the way I remembered it from childhood Octobers. When I pulled my truck to a stop outside Donnelly's Diner on the corner of Main and Jefferson, I sat there for a few minutes with the engine off. I wasn't ready, but I wasn't going to get any more ready just sitting in the parking lot. The bell above the diner door rang when I stepped inside. Every single head in the room turned. That's how small towns work. You can leave for 8 years. You can change everything about yourself. But the moment you walk back through a familiar door, it's like the room itself holds its breath. Marlene was behind the counter. She had worked that counter since before I left, and based on the look on her face, she planned to work it long after. She blinked twice, leaned forward slightly, and said my name like she was testing whether it still fit. Rosemary Carter. Morning, Marlene, I said. She stared at me for a second longer than felt comfortable. Well, she said softly, shaking her head. Didn't think we'd see you walking back in here. Neither did I replied honestly. I took a stool at the counter. Coffee appeared in front of me, without me asking. Black. She remembered. In small towns, they remember everything about you, especially the things you'd rather they forgot. You hear about your grandmother's place. Marlene asked carefully, pouring her own cup. I wrapped both hands around the warm mug. Something like that. She nodded like she already knew more than she was letting on. Across the room, old Mr. Donnelly sat in his usual corner booth with a newspaper folded over his knee. He had to be pushing 80 by now. He glanced at me over the top of his paper and gave one slow nod. I nodded back. In small towns, privacy is mostly just a polite illusion. Everyone knows. They just pretend they don't. And sitting there in that diner, drinking coffee that tasted exactly the same as it had when I was 18 years old, I thought about how I had ended up here. Not just back in this town, but back at this particular point in my life where the past I had worked so hard to move beyond was waiting for me at every corner. I had left Mason County 8 years earlier under conditions that no one in this town needed me to explain. The last real conversation I had with my parents ended with my father telling me I was throwing my life away and my mother nodding in agreement from across the kitchen table. I didn't argue. I didn't beg them to understand. I just packed a bag before sunrise and drove away without leaving an address. For a long time, that silence felt like freedom. I won't tell you everything that happened in those 8 years right now, because some parts of the story belong later. But here's what you need to know. I did not disappear. I did not fall apart. I built something. I worked hard at something that mattered. I became someone my grandmother would have been proud of. My parents, as far as I knew, had simply decided I didn't exist. But Grandma Ruth knew. We had written letters back and forth through the years. I had sent her money when she needed help with the grocery bill or a broken pipe. She always wrote back in that careful, looping handwriting of hers, telling me about the apple tree, the weather, the neighbor's dog who barked at nothing all night long. Small things. Real things. She never told my parents about our letters. When I asked her why once, she said, simply, because some things are between the two of us, sweetheart. Now she was gone, and everything between us had been folded into a will. 2 days after I arrived back in town, I was sitting on the porch of the farmhouse, watching the wind move through the golden October fields, when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I recognized the car immediately. My father's old Buick, the same one he had driven for 15 years. It pulled into the driveway, and both doors opened. Neither of them waved. My father walked toward the porch with a scowl already settled into his face. My mother followed a step behind, arms crossed. Her expression, the particular kind of closed-off look she wore whenever she had already decided how a conversation was going to go. You came back for the money, my father said. Not a question. A verdict. I kept my voice calm. It's not about money. My mother shook her head. You're gone for years, and the moment there's property involved, you appear on the doorstep. I stood up from my chair. I came because Grandma asked for me. That's funny, my father said, his voice sharp, because we were the ones here, taking care of her, paying attention while you were off doing whatever it is you've been doing all this time. That phrase, whatever it is you've been doing, landed like a needle, not because it was meant as a compliment, but because of what it revealed. He didn't know what I had been doing. He hadn't asked. He had simply decided the answer didn't matter. The argument lasted less than 5 minutes. It ended the way arguments in my family always ended, not with resolution, but with my father delivering a sentence meant to close the door. If you had any decency left in you, he said, you'd sign that house over to us. I didn't respond. I watched them walk back to the car. I watched the Buick back out of the gravel driveway and disappear down the road. Then I sat back down in the porch chair and listened to the wind. I already knew what was coming next. 3 days later, a sheriff's deputy knocked on the farmhouse door and handed me an envelope thick with paper, court documents. My parents were contesting the will. They claimed undue influence. They claimed the property had always been understood as a family asset. They claimed I had been absent and uninvolved. Their attorney's name was Harlan Pierce. I set the papers on my grandmother's kitchen table and read every single page. Then I read them again. I made a list of everything I had. The letters, the money orders, the records. And then I did something that surprised even me. I decided I didn't need a lawyer, not because I was careless, but because I had learned something over the years. When the truth is simple, it doesn't always need fancy language to make itself understood. A few days before the hearing, I met Harlan Pierce by chance on the courthouse steps. He was exactly the kind of attorney you expect to find in a county seat, polished shoes, careful gray hair, the steady smile of a man who has been paid to be confident. He extended his hand. Miss Carter, I represent your parents. I know, I said. He studied me the way someone studies a puzzle they expect to solve quickly. I'm sure you understand their concerns, he said pleasantly. Your grandmother's estate is significant to them at this stage of life. If you'd like to avoid the cost and discomfort of a hearing, there's a straightforward path. What kind of path? I asked. Sign the property to your parents. Clean and simple. I almost laughed. Instead, I said the same thing I had said to Marlene at the diner. I'll show up in court. His smile tightened, just slightly. Well, he said, adjusting his tie, we'll see what the judge thinks. He turned and walked up the courthouse steps. I stayed where I was for a moment, watching him go. Something told me Harlan Pierce had not done a single minute of research on who I actually was. That was going to matter. The night before the hearing, I sat at my grandmother's kitchen table with the will spread out in front of me. Grandma Ruth had been a practical woman. The document itself was simple, clean, and clear. The farmhouse and the 2 acres were mine. But tucked beneath the last signed page was something that wasn't a legal document at all. Just a single folded piece of paper in her handwriting. I had found it when I first reviewed the will, and I had read it 4 times since. It said this, Rosemary, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I know your parents don't understand you the way I do, but I always believed you were stronger than they ever gave you credit for. Don't let anyone tell you who you are. I folded the note carefully and slid it back beneath the will. She had always seen through people's assumptions. She had seen through mine and through theirs, and even from wherever she was now, it felt like she was still doing it. The morning of the hearing was cold, the kind of cold that catches you off guard even when you knew it was coming. The October wind rattled the flag above the courthouse as I climbed the steps, folder of documents tucked under my arm, no lawyer beside me. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of floor polish and old paper. People from town had already gathered in the courtroom, not because they had a legal stake in the outcome, But because family drama has always been the most reliable entertainment a small town can offer, my parents were seated at the front beside Harlan Pierce. My mother kept her eyes forward. My father stared at the wall. I took my seat at the opposite table, set my folder down, and folded my hands. Pierce looked across at me and raised his eyebrows. "You're representing yourself?" "Yes," I said. He gave a small, polite smile. "That's brave." He meant foolish. We both knew it, but I didn't correct him. The judge's name was Harold Whitaker. He was a lean man in his late 60s, silver-haired, with the kind of quietly exhausted eyes you see on people who have been listening to human conflict for decades and have long since stopped being surprised by any of it. He did not look like a man who enjoyed drama. He looked like a man who had seen too much of it. He sat down, adjusted his papers, and said without ceremony, "All right, let's begin." Harlan Pierce stood and buttoned his jacket. He began the way a good attorney always begins, with sympathy. "Your Honor, this is a painful situation for my clients," he said. "They are longtime members of this community. They cared for Mrs. Ruth Carter in the final chapter of her life. The property in question has been understood for years as a family home. It is, at its heart, a matter of fairness." He let the word fairness settle in the room for a moment. Then he continued. "The defendant," he said, glancing toward me with a practiced look of regret, "has been largely absent from this family for years. She did not contribute to the upkeep of the property. She did not participate in the daily responsibilities of care. She returned only after Mrs. Carter's passing. Only once there was something of value to collect." He wrapped his argument up neatly like a gift. Then he stepped back. Judge Whitaker looked toward the plaintiff's table. "Mrs. Carter, you may speak." My mother stood as though she had been waiting for permission to release something she had been holding inside for a very long time. "I raised her," she said. Her voice was tight, controlled, but barely. "I fed her. I gave her everything a mother is supposed to give. And she left. She just walked out and left us like we were nothing." Her voice climbed higher. "She didn't call. She didn't come for holidays. She wasn't there when her own grandmother got sick. And now she walks back and like none of that happened and expects to take something that belongs to this family." Judge Whitaker raised one hand, not to silence her, just to gently slow the pace. But my mother had carried these words for years, and now that they had a room and a judge and an audience, they were not going to slow down easily. She turned toward me, and then she said it, loud enough for the whole room to hear, without hesitation and without apology. "She's just a useless daughter. Not ungrateful, not difficult, not stubborn. Useless." The word moved through that courtroom like a cold current of air. For a single moment, nobody breathed. I heard someone in the back of the room whisper something. I heard a chair shift. I heard the soft sound of someone pressing their lips together and looking away. But here is what I want you to understand about that moment. I did not flinch. I did not drop my eyes. I did not shake my head or defend myself. I sat completely still and let the word land wherever it was going to land, because I had learned something a long time before that courtroom. The person who stays calm when everyone else is falling apart is not the person who feels nothing. They are the person who has already been through the fire. Judge Whitaker looked at me, long enough to notice the stillness, long enough to realize it was not defeat. Then he looked at my father. "Mr. Carter, do you wish to add anything?" My father stood slowly. "She always did things her own way," he said. "Never took direction. We tried to guide her. She thought she knew better. Then she left, and we dealt with everything alone. We're not young anymore, Your Honor. That house is something we can count on. It was not an angry speech. It was a tired one. And somehow that made it feel heavier. Pierce stepped in smoothly. Your Honor, my clients are on fixed incomes. Rising costs, medical expenses, property maintenance. These are real pressures. This home represents stability for them. Judge Whitaker nodded slowly. I understand those realities, he said. Then he looked at me. Ms. Carter, you are representing yourself. You may respond. I stood. Every face in that room turned toward me. I could feel the weight of the room's expectations. The people who had known me as a child, the strangers who had only heard one side of the story, my parents sitting 12 feet away, absolutely certain of how this was going to go. I looked at the judge and spoke calmly. My grandmother wrote her, well, clearly, I said, I have a copy here, along with documentation of our relationship, letters, and a record of money orders I sent her over the years when she needed help. Pierce gave a soft, dismissive smile. Money orders, he echoed, as though that was almost funny. I opened my folder and laid the papers on the table. I'd like to submit these to the clerk. I walked them forward. No drama. No speech about how misunderstood I was. Just paper and truth. Judge Whitaker began reading through the documents carefully. The courtroom fell into a silence that felt heavier than the one before it. Pierce shifted his weight. My mother stared at the judge. My father's hands tightened on the armrests of his chair. Judge Whitaker paused on one page longer than the others. Something in his expression changed. Not a dramatic shift, just a small tightening around the eyes, the kind of look a person makes when they discover something they were not expecting. He set his pen down. He looked up at me, then at my folder, then back at me, and then he said something that made every sound in that room disappear completely. Counselor, he said slowly, looking directly at Harlan Pierce. Before we go any further, do you really not know who she is? Pierce's hand stopped moving. His smile faded. He straightened slightly, the way a man does when he realizes he may have missed something important. My understanding, Pierce said carefully, is that she is the defendant in this case, Your Honor. Judge Whitaker did not smile. No, he said quietly. That's not what I asked. The courtroom did not move. My mother leaned forward in her seat. My father frowned. Behind me, I could feel the energy in the room shifting like weather before a storm. Judge Whitaker held up one of the documents from the stack the clerk had handed him. He tapped it once with his pen. Counselor, he said, when you are preparing to argue about a person's character in this courtroom, it is generally wise to first understand who that person is. Pierce leaned forward slightly to read the page the judge was indicating. The silence stretched long and uncomfortable. Then Pierce's eyes widened, just barely, just enough for anyone watching closely to notice. He straightened slowly. I was not aware, he said. Judge Whitaker set the document down and looked at the room. For the record, he said, his voice unhurried, Ms. Rosemary Carter is a decorated United States Army veteran. She completed 2 deployments overseas. She was awarded a commendation for service above and beyond the call of duty. She has been employed for the last 4 years as a federal contractor with the Department of Veterans Affairs in a role that requires the highest level of security clearance this country issues to a civilian. He paused, and the money orders in this folder, the ones sent to Mrs. Ruth Carter over the past 7 years, total just over $14,000. The silence in that courtroom was a different kind of silence now. It was not the silence of a room waiting for something. It was the silence of a room that had just understood something it could not take back. I looked at my parents. My mother's face had gone the color of old paper. Her mouth was slightly open. She was not looking at the judge. She was looking at me. And for the first time in my life, I could not read the expression on her face. It was not quite shame. It was not quite surprise. It was something closer to the look of a person who has just walked confidently into a room and discovered the floor is not where they thought it was. My father was very still. His jaw was set, the way it always was when he was processing something he had not prepared for. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life believing that being in the room made him the authority in it. He was a man who had handed out verdicts his whole life, to his wife, to his children, to anyone who wandered into the radius of his certainty. And right now he was sitting in a courtroom in the county seat of the town he had lived in for 50-something years, and a judge was reading aloud from a document that described his daughter, the one he had called a disappointment, the one his wife had just called useless in front of 30 people, as someone this country had trusted with its most serious work. Harlan Pierce cleared his throat. Your Honor, my clients were not fully informed. No, Judge Whitaker said, simply, they were not. He folded his hands on the bench. He looked at Pierce for a long moment with the patience of a man who has seen 100 versions of this particular situation and has long since formed his opinion of it. Mr. Pierce, he said, the argument you have presented today rests almost entirely on character. You have argued that Ms. Carter was absent, that she was uninvolved, that she contributed nothing to her grandmother's life or well-being, that she returned only when there was something to gain. He tapped the folder of documents with one finger. The record directly contradicts all of that. Pierce opened his mouth, closed it again. Furthermore, Judge Whitaker continued, the will itself is not ambiguous. It is properly executed, properly witnessed, and reflects the clearly stated wishes of a woman who was, by all available evidence, of sound and independent mind when she wrote it. He looked at my parents. The claim of undue influence requires evidence of pressure or manipulation. What I have before me is the opposite, a granddaughter who maintained a consistent, financially supportive relationship with her grandmother across 8 years of distance, documented by a paper trail that your clients apparently never knew existed. He let that land. Then he looked at me. Ms. Carter, do you have anything to add before I make my ruling? I had been waiting for this moment without knowing it for longer than I could accurately measure. I had prepared words. I had thought about this in the truck on the way back to Mason County, on the porch of the farmhouse watching the October fields, at the kitchen table over my grandmother's handwriting. I had thought about what I wanted to say when I finally had a room and a reason to say it. But standing there, with 30 people watching and my parents sitting 12 feet away, and Judge Whitaker looking at me with the steady eyes of a man who had already made up his mind and was simply giving me the floor, I found that most of what I had prepared felt unnecessary. The documents had done the work. The truth had done the work. All that was left was the part that belonged to me alone. I said, I left this town 8 years ago because I had to, not because I stopped caring about the people in it. I stopped coming back because the cost of coming back was higher than I could afford at the time. But I never stopped being here for the person who mattered most. And she never stopped being there for me. I paused. My grandmother knew who I was. She knew what I was doing. She knew why I was gone. She chose to leave me this property because she trusted me with it, not because she was confused or pressured or manipulated, but because she made a clear and deliberate decision about what she wanted to happen to the home she had lived in for 50 years. I intend to honor that decision. I intend to take care of that house the same way I took care of her, quietly, consistently, and without needing anyone to see me do it. I sat down. Judge Whitaker was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you, Miss Carter." He picked up his pen. "The court finds in favor of the defendant. The will of Ruth and Carter stands as written. The farmhouse and the 2 acres of land described therein are the legal property of Rosemary Jean Carter, effective immediately. The plaintiff's motion is denied." He set down his pen. "We're adjourned." The gavel came down, once clean and final. For a moment the room was perfectly still. Then it moved. Chairs shifted. People rose. Someone near the back exhaled loudly, the sound of a person who had been holding their breath for longer than they realized. Marlene, who had apparently decided to take an extended coffee break from the diner, was sitting 2 rows back. She met my eyes and gave me a single nod, slow and deliberate, the same nod old Mr. Donnelly had given me that first morning at the counter. The nod of someone who has lived in a small town long enough to know that the truth always finds its level eventually. It just sometimes takes a courtroom to do it. I gathered my documents from the table. I slid them back into the folder one by one, carefully, the way my grandmother had always folded things before putting them away. I closed the folder. I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair. My parents had not moved. I walked past their table on the way to the door. I did not stop. I did not say anything cutting or final or rehearsed. I did not need to. But as I passed, I looked at my father, just briefly, the way you look at someone when you want them to know you saw them clearly and that the seeing cost you nothing, and I kept walking. My mother said my name, not in the way she had said it in the courtroom, not with the tight, pressurized voice of a woman releasing 8 years of grievance into a public room. Just my name, in a voice I had not heard from her since I was very small, thin, and uncertain, the voice of someone who is not sure they have any right to the word they are saying. I stopped. I turned around. She was still seated. Her hands were folded in her lap. She looked smaller than she had when she walked in, which is a thing that happens to people when they have been carrying a version of themselves that turns out to be unsustainable. They sit down, and the extra weight just goes somewhere else, and what is left is closer to the actual person underneath. "I didn't know," she said, "about the deployments, about the VA work, about any of it." I looked at her for a long moment. There were 100 things I could have said. There were 100 true and accurate and pointed things I had every right to say to this woman in this room on this particular morning. I chose none of them. I said, "I know you didn't." And then I said the thing I had not planned to say, the thing that came up from somewhere below the prepared words, from the place where the 8 years lived and the letters lived and the $14,000 in money orders lived, from the place where a little girl used to sit on a farmhouse porch and feel safe in a way she never quite felt at home. She asked about you. I said, "Grandma Ruth," every single letter. She always asked how you were doing. She always said she hoped things would get better between us. I paused. She never gave up on it. My mother pressed her lips together. Her eyes filled. She did not speak. "Neither have I said, "but I need you to understand something. The version of me you had in your head, the one you described today, that was never me. I need you to know that. Not for the court record, just for the truth of it." I turned and walked out of the courtroom. The afternoon light hit me when I pushed through the courthouse doors. That pale October sun that doesn't warm you much, but is glad to see you anyway. And I stood at the top of the steps for a moment and breathed it in, The same courthouse steps where Harlan Pierce had offered me a clean and simple exit 4 days ago. The same town that had held its breath when I walked into the diner. The same Mason County that smelled like fallen leaves and would smoke, and the particular version of the past that belongs to places you grew up in and left and came back to older than when you left. I drove back to the farmhouse. I parked in the gravel driveway and sat in the truck for a minute with the engine off, looking at the white house with the apple tree out front, the branches bare now in October, but still holding their shape, still exactly where they had always been. The porch where Grandma Ruth had drunk her morning tea. The front door with the black iron handle she had replaced 3 times over the years and always chose the same style because she liked the weight of it in her hand. The windows with the old wooden frames she had repainted herself at 74 because she said it didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be taken care of. I got out of the truck and walked up to the porch and sat down in the chair I had been sitting in when my parents pulled into the driveway 3 days ago. The same chair, the same view of the fields. The wind was doing the same thing it had been doing all October, moving through the dry grass in long, patient sweeps, the way it had moved through it when I was a child sitting on this same porch being told that I didn't have to stay where I wasn't wanted. I understood now what she had meant when she said it. Not just that I could leave the town or leave my parents' house. She meant something bigger than geography. She meant that the version of yourself that other people construct out of their own needs and limitations is not a building you are required to live inside. You can step out of it. You can let it stand there without you and build something real outside of it. It takes time, and it costs things you would rather not pay, and nobody gives you a medal for doing it. But it is possible. I was evidence of that. I was sitting on this porch as evidence of that. I went inside and made coffee in my grandmother's kitchen in the same old percolator she had used for 30 years, and I stood at the kitchen window and drank it and looked out at the backyard where the vegetable garden had gone to sleep for the season. I thought about what I was going to do with the house. I had been thinking about it since the phone call with Pastor Caldwell, turning it over in the background of everything else that had been happening. I was not going to sell it. I had known that from the beginning. The question was what kind of life I was going to build around it. My work with the VA was largely remote. I had structured it that way deliberately over the past 2 years, in the quiet understanding that flexibility was the most valuable thing I could build into a career after 8 years of having almost none. I could work from here. I could work from this kitchen table, from this chair on this porch. I could wake up every morning in the house where I had first felt safe and go to sleep every night knowing it was mine and that no one could take it. And that was not a small thing. That was not a fine thing. That was an enormous thing, and I intended to treat it like one. Marlene stopped by that evening with a covered dish. She knocked on the farmhouse door with the particular knock of someone who has been wanting to do a thing for a while and has finally found the excuse. I opened the door, and she held out a casserole dish covered in foil and said, "Green bean and chicken." Ruth's favorite, not mine, but it seemed right. I took it and said thank you, and she stood on the porch for a moment looking at the apple tree, and then said, without quite looking at me, "What you did in that courtroom today, the way you handled yourself, that's going to be talked about in this town for a long time, Rosemary." She paused. "In the good way." I said, "I was just telling the truth." She said, "That's why." She left before it got dark. I ate the casserole at the kitchen table with the will and my grandmother's handwritten note spread out beside the plate, and I read the note one more time. "Don't let anyone tell you who you are." I thought about all the years I had spent carrying other people's definitions of me, the way you carry a bag that is too heavy, but that you have had on your shoulder for so long you have forgotten. It is an option to set it down. I thought about the courtroom and my mother's voice, and the word useless hanging in the air, and the way I had sat still and let it land without it sticking. That was not nothing. That was the whole thing, actually. That was the result of 8 years of building a self that was anchored deep enough that one word in a room full of people could not pull it loose. My father called 2 weeks later. It was a Wednesday morning, and I was on the porch with coffee and a notebook working through a project brief, and his number came up on my phone, and I sat with it ringing for 3 full rings before I answered. We talked for 18 minutes. It was not a comfortable conversation. He was not a man built for apology, and he did not deliver one in any clean or satisfying form. What he said was closer to an explanation than an apology, the way tired men often confuse those two things. He said he had not realized the extent of what I had done. He said he had told himself a version of me that he now understood had not been accurate. He said he was not sure what to do with that. I said, "You don't have to do anything with it right now. I'm not going anywhere." There was a long pause on his end. Then he said, "Your grandmother always said you were the strongest one. I thought she just said that because you were the one who needed the most encouragement." Another pause. I think I was wrong about that. I looked out at the apple tree, the bare October branches, the way the morning light came through them in thin slanted lines. I said, "Yeah, you were." It was not forgiveness, not yet, not in the full and complete sense. Forgiveness is something I believe in and something I was moving toward, but it has a pace and a timeline that belongs to itself and cannot be rushed without becoming something hollow and performative that serves the person who wronged you more than it serves you. What I had in that moment was something more like the decision to leave a door open, not wide, not without conditions, but open, because Grandma Ruth had never given up on it, and because I was living in her house now, and because the least I could do was honor the hope she had carried for all of us with a little more patience than she had received in return. The apple tree bloomed in April. I had not expected to be there for it because I had not let myself plan that far ahead. And then one morning I woke up and looked out the bedroom window, and it was covered in white blossoms. Every branch, the whole tree just full of white against the pale April sky. And I stood at that window for a long time, and I thought about all the Aprils my grandmother had seen from this window, and how she had stayed in this house for 50 years and tended this tree and written letters on the kitchen table and drunk her tea on the porch and held on to the belief that the people she loved were capable of more than they were currently giving. I thought she had been right. I thought she had been right about most things. I went to the porch with my coffee, and I sat in the chair that was mine now, and I looked at the tree and the road and the fields beginning to go green again at the edges, and the town of Mason County coming back to life around me the way it did every spring, the same and continuous and exactly itself. And I thought about how the truth of a person is not always the loudest thing in the room. Sometimes it is the quietest. Sometimes it lives in money orders and handwritten letters and a folder of documents laid on a table without ceremony and a voice that stays level when every instinct says to break. Sometimes it takes 8 years and a courtroom and a judge who bothers to read the fine print before it finds the room it was always meant to fill. But it gets there. That is what I know now more than anything. It gets there. I am still in the farmhouse. I am sitting on this porch right now. The apple tree is behind me, and the fields are in front of me, and the air smells like the particular mix of earth and spring and whatever the morning is deciding to be. I have the VA work and the notebook on my knee and the coffee that is getting cold because I keep forgetting to drink it. And I have this house that is mine. And I have the note in my grandmother's handwriting in the top drawer of the kitchen table that I do not need to read anymore because I have memorized it, but that I keep there anyway because some things earn their place not by being useful, but by being true. Don't let anyone tell you who you are. I don't intend to. If this story meant something to you, leave me a comment. Tell me what part of it landed. Tell me if you have been in a room where someone said something about you that was wrong and you had to decide whether to fight it or let the truth speak for itself. I read everything you write, and I mean that. And if you are not subscribed yet, please do it right now, because there are more stories coming, and they are all built from the same place this one was.